It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Back after spending a week in Massachusetts visiting friends with the question, who's really to blame for the Spider-Man debacle? Is it Disney and Marvel Studios, or is it Sony Pictures? Well, if you've been listening to Midnight's Edge as Andre, you might get the impression that it's more Sony. The reason... because initially they had gone ahead and taken the position, okay, yeah, this is probably more Disney, but now they're firmly, well, not firmly, but, more into the blame Sony camp. Reason for that being revelations by Deadline Hollywood, which originally broke the story, coming out with more information suggesting that Disney had offered a better deal to Sony 6 months ago, and that Sony really kind of kept them hanging. But I'm still giving the blame, more of the blame to Disney. Now, it's not that I blame Disney exclusively. Sony does bear its share of responsibility, but I do put more of it on Disney for reasons that are listed by Thomas Bacon and Thomas Bacon over at Screen Rant. So, I know some people have a negative opinion of Screen Rant. I've not delved into that, but, if you've got some accurate information that debunks this, feel free to post a link to it or something in the comments. But I've seen so far no reason not to believe what this guy has to say. So here's a couple of things that have been... it's like September 12th now when I'm recording this, and this was from August, so it is a little bit, it is a little bit outdated, but it does seem that this is something that actually has been building up on both sides, and it's still kind of more Disney's fault than it is Sony's, even though there's plenty of blame to go around. All right, so let's go ahead and break this down. So the Spider-Man partnership between Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures appears to have come to an end, but it isn't entirely Sony's fault. In 2015, Marvel and Sony reached a deal that allowed a rebooted Spider-Man to enter the MCU. Tom Holland's Peter Parker was introduced in 2016's Captain America: Civil War, and over the last few years, he's become one of the MCU's greatest heroes. Spider-Man Far From Home even set him up as the next Tony Stark. Now, though the Marvel-Sony deal seems to have come to an end, it's turned into something of a PR nightmare for Sony, as angry fans blame them for the situation. The studio lost the fan base's goodwill in 2014 as a result of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and a hack that exposed their poor decision-making processes. And once goodwill is lost, it's hard to get it back, even after the Oscar-winning Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But is it fair to blame Sony for the end of their deal with Marvel Studios? And this is where it really kicks in. Because, as Bacon writes, it's important to remember that the Marvel-Sony deal was absolutely unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever happened before in the history of cinema. Two rival studios had found a way to work together to mutual benefit. Unfortunately, that means an agreement like this was always going to be unstable in the long term. Corporate priorities inevitably change for Marvel, their parent company Disney, and even for Sony, and as a result, it was always going to be difficult to keep the deal going. Even Marvel Studios can only invest their time in so many projects at once. For Disney, the current priorities are the Disney Plus streaming service and recouping the costs of the Fox acquisition, which a lot of people don't take into account, because Disney and Marvel have to try and find a way to work X-Men and Fantastic Four into the MCU, and that might actually, if you believe Sony, might actually share the blame for the end of Spider-Man agreement. The Sony deal doesn't figure into those corporate priorities at all. There are reports Disney made a controversial offer to Sony to keep it going, to split production costs and profits 50-50, making the solo Spider-Man films more viable for them. Deadline reported that they even proposed extending this to other films based on Spider-Man characters, such as Venom 2 and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse 2. Which, again, as have you seen on John Campia's podcast with Robert Meyer Burnett, the final deal that Disney offered that appears to have really been the nail in the proverbial coffin, it basically would have meant Sony giving up control over a property that it has the movie rights to. I mean, no studio is going to do that, ever. So, that was kind of a huge mistake on Disney's part, but maybe it was deliberate, because it appears, and again, and this is where Sony really does have to take responsibility here, that they decided after the success of Venom at the box office and the critical success of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, it actually won an Oscar this year. It decided basically that, okay, now we're confident enough that we can resurrect our own Spider-Man cinematic universe, and we've learned everything we can from Kevin Feige, so we're going to strike back out and do this on our own. Now that Marvel's basically bailed us out. That's where they come into the picture as far as taking the blame goes. Disney, on the other hand, did screw up here in that they started off with better deals, offering better deals to Sony, and then proceeding to offer worse ones. So, I mean, if you're trying to convince Sony to cooperate with you and take the deal that you want them to so that you can have your Spider-Man because basically, now that the Avengers saga is pretty much over on the big screen, pending a total reboot, you're really not going to see the Marvel Cinematic Universe do quite as well as it has up until now, because this is kind of like the climax, with Avengers Endgame, and now everything here is like anticlimactic. I mean, the Black Widow movie, which honestly, it's a prequel because Black Widow is now dead within the MCU, and trying to find a way to bring her back. And, Scarlett Johansson, she's getting up in years. I mean, she's in her 30s. She was already over 30 when she started playing Black Widow. And now, she's getting to the point where she's going to be pushing 40. And even though they're using that de-aging CGI to make actors look younger than they really are, but the fact is she is getting older and she can only play that character for so long. So, and doing a prequel, I mean, seriously, she should have gotten her own movie long before this. So, there's really not a whole lot, and of course, you've got Black Panther 2 that is also slated for release. But, again, a lot of the success of the standalone movies was based in part on Avengers. And now that Avengers is over, how well are those movies going to do? So Disney really needed Spider-Man more than they were willing to admit. And yet they went ahead and made decreasing offers that Sony just could not accept. And that's the last thing you want to do. So Disney did get greedy, okay? So let's not, dismiss Disney's own role in this, especially when you consider this little bit of information. Because this goes all the way back to the 1990s. And a lot of people don't realize this. Because Disney is rather infamous for lobbying to extend copyright law to try and keep Mickey Mouse under its corporate ownership. And again, this is by Thomas Bacon from August 25th. In one of the biggest cases of corporate irony, Disney's own copyright lobbying in the 1990s ultimately cost the MCU its Spider-Man. The last week has seen the dramatic breakdown of the Marvel-Sony deal, which allowed Marvel to reboot Spider-Man as part of the MCU. It's probably the single biggest blow Marvel's shared universe has suffered since it began in 2008, made worse because Spider-Man Far From Home set Tom Holland's Peter Parker up as the next Tony Stark. Naturally, there's a lot of blame to go around, and say Spider-Man is trending worldwide. Sony, Spider-Man, and Tom Holland are all trending topics. Even Jeremy Renner has taken to social media to appeal to Sony to come back to the negotiating table. And yet, while all the attention is focused on Sony, the real reason Spider-Man can't enter the MCU is rooted in changes to copyright law that were the result of Disney lobbying over Mickey Mouse. Disney has long been fighting a running political battle to ensure the copyright license to Mickey Mouse continues for as long as possible. As a direct result of Disney lobbying, in 1998, Congress overhauled the copyright system to retroactively extend everything created between 1923 and 1977 to a 95-year term. That meant Mickey Mouse is safe at Disney until 2023, while Spider-Man won't become public domain until 2057. In the long run, this has now resulted in the situation where Marvel Studios no longer has access to the superhero sometimes described as Marvel's Mickey Mouse. The CTEA was surprisingly uncontroversial back in the 1990s. Senator Hank Brown was in a minority when he wrote a 1996 report arguing against it. The real incentive here is for corporate owners that bought copyrights to lobby Congress for another 20 years of revenue, he complained, not for creators who will be long dead once this term extension takes hold. But the opponents of reform were divided, each with their own agenda. In a bizarre twist, the biggest obstacle was an opportunistic side campaign by the restaurant industry to get a broader exemption for small bars and restaurants to play copyrighted music in the background. Policymakers eventually agreed to pass the Fairness in Music Licensing Act to meet their demands, and the CTEA then passed without a hitch. Disney and the other corporate lobbyists were naturally delighted. The CTEA became a lot more controversial after it became law. An online publisher named Eric Eldred challenged whether or not it was constitutional for Congress to retroactively extend copyright. This gained much more public support than the unsuccessful campaign to block the legislation in the first place, with economists such as Milton Friedman, Ronald Coase, and Kenneth Arrow supporting him. Eldred failed, but in cultural terms, his challenge seemed to prove something of a watershed moment. For the first time, the public became engaged with the debate over copyright, and cultural and political experts draw a straight line between his court case and the successful campaign to block the Stop Online Piracy Act in 2012. Disney seems to be resigned to losing Mickey Mouse's copyright in 2023, and there's no evidence they've even begun to lobby for another extension. And here's the ultimate irony. If not for the CTEA in 1998, which was a direct result of Disney lobbying, the copyright for Spider-Man would have already expired. The wall crawler would have become public domain on January 1st, 2019, meaning Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures could both have made Spider-Man movies. As it stands, barring another deal with Sony, Marvel won't be able to use Spider-Man again until the late 2050s, and it's all thanks to Disney. So, yeah, I mean, this is... And, you know, you can read the entire article when I link to it in the description here. But basically, you know, a lot of this has to do with Disney making some very short-sighted decisions 20 years ago, coming back to bite them here in the present, and also not taking into account that the deal with Sony was always going to be a limited time offer. They knew this, but for some reason they decided, oh, we're not going to make any serious offers that Sony can live with, so we're just going to make worse and worse ones. Basically, they're offering disincentives to Sony to continue the deal as is. And the more they made offers that were worse and worse, the fewer incentives Sony had to actually go back to the negotiating table. So really, I don't think it's fair to place the bulk of the blame on Sony. I mean, it's not to say that Sony isn't at fault. I do think they are suffering from a bit of hubris because, you know, they did screw up the Spider-Man franchise, first with Spider-Man 3, which was under Sam Raimi's trilogy. That's when they really started interfering with the production, and it's one of the reasons why he and Tobey Maguire decided, you know, we're done. We're going on to other projects. You guys want to keep interfering? We're done. So, you know, then Alex Klutzman was brought in to kind of head up the Spider-Man franchise, and, you know, we can see how well that worked because Alex Klutzman screwed up Spider-Man, he screwed up Universal. He's screwing up Star Trek now. There's nothing that boy touches that isn't completely ruined. And, he just manages to fail upward and keep getting gigs like this. So now Sony, after the success of Venom and Into the Spider-Verse, is getting cocky and thinking, okay, we don't need Marvel. I think that's debatable. So yeah, I mean, they do have at least 45% of the blame, but 55% of the blame still, I think, rests with Disney because of their short-sightedness back in the 1990s, and also because they really should have planned to make an offer that Sony could actually live with. I mean, if they wanted to keep things as they were, they could have said, look, let's just, keep things as they are. Why don't we do something where we can each make Spider-Man movies, but, you'll still get what's due to you because you own the movie rights. But Disney wanted to get greedy and act as though it could make a disincentivizing offer, and Sony was, I mean, no studio would accept the terms that Disney was offering by the time all this fell apart last month. So, I still put the bulk of the blame on Disney. If you want to blame Sony, go ahead. I mean, it's not like I'm saying, don't blame Sony at all. They're completely blameless. No, there are no angels at all in this conflict. So if you think that one side or the other is the innocent victim of the other's corporate greed, no, there's plenty of blame to go around. But I do think there is somewhat more blame for Marvel and Disney because they decided to get greedy and get really stupid, and also, actions that took place 20 years ago are now also coming back to bite them in the ass. So, yeah, that's pretty much my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear more, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we upload new content. And if you want to help support the channel, keep the lights on, help us bring you more content, head over to our Patreon or subscribe to our page. We can't do this without you. Until next time, this is Michael Wilk for The Wilk Report saying take care, good night, I'm out.